We are going live, and I think we are live. Edward, please confirm, but it looks like we are. Hi, I'm Andrea Wilson Woods. I'm here again today, another week with the Ask the Author session. I am really excited to talk to David Metzger. I've actually already interviewed him once, but we're going to pretend like we've never met before. So we're going to jump right in. And if you are watching this in real time and you want to throw some comments on, please do. We do have someone moderating the chat. So if you're watching this on Facebook, YouTube, or more likely LinkedIn, please be sure to put your comments in the chat, any questions you have for David, and we will definitely ask him. So David, tell us who you are and what you do.
Andrea, so good to be here. Thanks a lot. And I'm excited to talk to you and to your listeners as well. My name is David Metzger, and I am a pediatric oncology nurse and also an author of a recent book called Nurse Papa.
So let's talk about the book. As you know, I'm about 75% into it, but
I'm
tell
very
us
excited
what
for you.
tell us what the book is about and why did you write it?
I mean, the book is basically about the intersection of my life as a pediatric oncology nurse and my intersection, or excuse me, in my life as a parent. And it's been a real journey, and both those roles have affected each other and changed each other. And the book talks all about that and really offers um, a set of meditations for parents and pretty much anybody who navigates this world.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you, how long did it take you to write the book? That's a question I get all the time. So let me ask you that. How long?
It took way too long.
That's honest.
Um, I started writing the book on my iPhone,
Mm.
like in the halls of the hospital and on the commute to work.
Oh,
About
wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I had so many ideas and thoughts that would just kind of pop into my head. So I wasn't always sitting at my computer, and it was a way for me to just kind of get those thoughts out and organize myself. But that started over 5 years ago. I'd say the bulk of the writing took about 3 to 4 years. And then there was the long editing process and then the excruciating process of publishing, as you know.
Yes, yes, I do. This is for people who, if they're not sure, this is a memoir. It is nonfiction, and you quote many of your coworkers in the book. So I'm just curious if you changed their names, and also how did they feel about you writing the book, and then how have they responded to the book?
So some of my coworkers chose to have pseudonyms just because they're more private people, and other people love to see their name on the page, just like I do. Um, and the book, I would try to be really mindful when I was writing this book to not just have my point of view, because my point of view is singular, and I'm not in every place at one time, and there's so many things going on that I'm unaware of. So I interviewed about 30 to 40 of my colleagues, nurses, doctors, former patients, parents of patients who had died, some who had lived. So that was a real incredible process where I got to enter these people's homes, people who I thought I knew, but maybe I didn't know them well enough, and really learn more about them and what they thought about the job we do. Because not many people get to see what happens in these really rarefied places in the hospital, these life and death situations, where life absolutely continues. So I think for me at least, that was a really cathartic, meaningful process because I got to know people in an entirely new way. And then since the book has been published and many of my colleagues have read the book, I think they've really appreciated having that viewpoint out there in a way that wasn't before. And appreciate just the book for what it is, just a meditation on parenthood and just being human in this world.
I love that you did interviews. That's something I always recommend, and that's definitely something I did for my book. I want to go on to your path because while you knew you wanted to be a nurse, you did not expect to go into pediatric oncology. So I want to know why that decision happened, even though I actually already know. But I also want to talk about this idea about nursing school because
Mm,
I had a neurosurgeon say to me once, and I thought it was really well said, that he learned the science of being a doctor in medical school, but the art of being a doctor and dealing with patients, and really understanding them, that was, that took years and years. So, what did nursing school teach you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned in the book that in nursing school, I learned how to be a really good nursing student. But when it came to entering the high learning curve of a pediatric oncology ward, just the intense medicine, the intense physiology, and just like learning how to manage your day, taking care of super sick kids, I'd say close to nothing. um,
Much
you
like
know,
that doctor, right?
Yeah, my teachers were the senior nurses on the floor and the patients and the parents. I mean, every single day as a new nurse that first year was just a day of absolute knowledge devastation because I had to like tear down what I thought I knew and rebuild it up. Not only just like being a nurse, but just being a person among people who are going through such intense situations in their lives. And I think anybody who enters that scene thinking that they know what they're doing, which occasionally I was that person, was just in store for a lot of pain because it's one of those fields where you just have to be open to learning constantly. Even now, 14 years in, every day I learn something and it's awesome.
And why pediatric oncology? Tell us that story because I know it's very interesting. Because that was not your
So
plan, right?
Well, pediatrics was not my plan. I
Yeah.
came into nursing school. We had to choose what we wanted to be. So I chose to be adult acute care because that seemed like a good place to start. And I remember the first day of my first pediatric rotation in nursing school, I was walking in the hall and some nurse tapped me on the shoulder, which is such a constant motif in my life, and said, "Can you do this?" So she led me into a room. She wanted me to watch a child who was sad, but yes, the child was very sad. She was a 2-year-old, standing in her crib. There was no parents there, and she
Mm.
was screaming her head off. And I remembered I'd never really spent much time with kids, and I had no idea what to do with her. And my discomfort was so palatable. So I just picked her up and I did what I know how to do. I started singing. And, within a minute, she stopped crying and she put her thumb in her mouth. And we just sat there together, swinging back and forth, just being together. And, it was that moment that I realized I needed to take care of kids, that I needed to focus on that population. And
Wow.
it was a lot, it was very difficult because I basically had to drop out of my program to do it. So I always recognize that as a real moment of clarity in my life. And, I know that you know this too, that there are these just times where your inner person is just talking to you, telling you what you're supposed to do. And there's so many times when you don't want to listen to them because it's so hard. It's so hard to actually admit who you are. But I did do it this time. Many times I haven't done it and I've suffered. But this time I did it and it really led me to, well, more pain too, but ultimately to a place where I really feel at home.
Okay. And I just want to remind people that if you're watching this in real time or you're watching it later, please, any questions you have for David, put them in the comments and we will make sure he gets them. If you're watching this in real time right now, we will actually, answer any questions that you have, or he will answer any questions that you might have. So David knows I'm doing this. I'm not ambushing him. I did warn him. So early on, there was something in the book that caught my attention. And I have to, just for the people watching who may not know, I come from a completely biased place. I was the parent for my sister. I raised her for 7 years during my 20s until she died from stage 4 liver cancer. And her cancer journey was really short. So we had our own experience with pediatric oncology nurses, most of which were really good. But I do have a hard time with things still. So I just want to read this and then ask you about it. So, my profound sympathy for their plights took a hiatus, returning transformed into sincere empathy. I was a nurse to children, but after I became a parent, and then it goes on from there. And one of the reasons this struck me was I understand how you would really have a deeper understanding of being a parent because you weren't a parent when you started your career. But I kind of push back because you can't be entirely empathetic because you've never been the parent of a child who's sick, right?
Mhm.
So I just want to talk about that idea for a second, and also how did becoming a parent of your own children change your work?
It's true that my kids have never been sick with cancer, but they've suffered. One thing that you're taught in nursing school is that pain is pain. If you walk into a room and somebody says, "I'm in 10 out of 10 pain," but they have a stoic, calm face, you have to believe that pain. Pain comes in many forms. So I feel like you just have to enter a space which that is given to you. And I do know what it means for a child to be suffering, whether that means they're just upset or they're sick, even if those that child of mine doesn't have cancer. But another thing that being a parent really helped me do with these parents was kind of join the club.
Mm.
Would whenever I do take care of a child and their parent is there, I always talk about my kids. I mean, I love my kids. I'm so proud of them. But part of the reason I talk about them is because I want them to know that I know what it's like to be a parent, the hard parts, the amazing parts. And I want them to know that I know how to treat their child and that I'll treat them just like I would my child. So that empathy, even though I don't fully understand what it's like to care for a dying child, it it's a doorway into that space because I am a dad.
So before you were a parent, how were you different as a pediatric oncology nurse? Or were
I
you?
I mean, it's hard to say because I also was just a younger nurse, and
Mm.
for many years didn't know what I was doing. I think it's really
Okay, don't let that secret out.
no, I mean, it's okay. It's okay. One thing is I was always very honest with parents. If I didn't know the answer to something, I always say, and even to this day, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find the answer for you, and we'll do it together. But for me, I think it just puts me in a different space, and I think that shows in how I care for kids. It just allows me to be more patient. I think we both know how difficult it can be to be a caretaker to a young person. This just like amazing life that you're trying to steer in the right direction. And I think having that experience just allows me to navigate kids in a way I was unable to before. All these little tricks that aren't tricks, they're just being a parent that you just have to master and fail at. And I've done that thousands of times with my own kids, and I do that thousands of times, a day with the kids I'm with in the hospital. It's a way of being. When you're a
Right.
parent, you're just a different beast.
Yeah.
It's hard to
Yeah,
explain.
that's true. Um, because you mentioned it, I wanna just, quote your book, and if you see me looking down, it's because all my notes are on my phone. So, "The vast difference between my expectations of parenthood and the controlled chaos and emotional turbulence that it actually is." I think I missed a few words there, but, um, one thing I really have to say about your book is that you are unflinchingly honest, even to the point where sometimes you come across as unsympathetic. And I actually like it because I want to know the real you. And sometimes when I read books, especially medical memoirs, I feel like people are sort of shielding a side of themselves. And so in this chapter, Returning Home, yeah, you talk about, or it might be right after, but you talk about this temper tantrum,
Mhm.
not that your kids had, that you had, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, to give it some context, I think I had a very difficult day taking care of sick children who were not my own. um, when you're a nurse, and especially a pediatric nurse, you give so much of yourself. And I think that as humans, we only have a certain amount of emotional energy that we can push around to ourselves and other people. And sometimes I come home empty, like just an empty vessel, not just like physically tired, but emotionally just vacant. And it's something that to this day I still try to navigate because I'm sorry to say that sometimes I am the best person, 100% the best person I have the capacity to be at work for these kids and their families. And I come home and I don't have that same thing to offer to my own kids and my own wife. And it is
Mm,
the happiest and saddest thing in my life because one thing I've learned that in life is that the most satisfying thing to do is to give, just to give of yourself, and it doesn't seem like that's what would make you happy, but it's what makes me happy. It's just that's to give, and then I come home and I don't have the same thing to give, so I come home impatient sometimes. I come home tired. I come home sad. If I've taken care of a patient who's died, um, and I don't have the kind of um, will and patience for my own family that I would really love to have.
Yeah,
Doesn't
you
mean I don't always have it, but sometimes I don't
yeah.
have enough.
No, I think you say it perfectly here. You say, "I am the man I've always strived to be with my young patients and their parents while being at my worst with my kids and my wife."
Yeah, that's accurate.
Well, you said it, so I didn't say it. Um, how does your wife feel about your career as a pediatric oncology nurse, knowing how draining it is, knowing how sometimes you come home with nothing left to give?
I think she thinks that's unfortunate. I mean, she understands why I do, and my wife also does very hard work. She's a asylum attorney, so she um, helps people who face genocide and face rape and murder in their own
Wow.
countries to get you know to get asylum in the United States, and it's not a job that she gets paid well for. It's a nonprofit. It's what she does. She doesn't come home as angry as I am sometimes, but or as empty. But she knows it. She gets it. She also has to kind of make that mode switch. When you come home and you've spent hours hearing of these horrible stories of abuse and rape and incest, and you have to come home to take care of your kids. She gets it. My wife is extremely patient with me. She knows what I have to offer as a person and a husband, and and that I can't always offer it to my full capacity. But it's something we're both working on. It's just if you want to do something meaningful in your life, you can't expect to come away unscathed. I mean, you're going to have your wounds, and it's
Yeah.
just that's how it goes.
So I want to jump into this chapter called Leaving Home, and I'm going to read two different parts of it. First of all, I just love the way it's written. And because I'm a big believer in showing and not telling. And I like to know, I'm going to also ask you right before I hit record, you talked about that was a process in writing for you, but you have these just two great phrases about your morning. The old hardwood floor follows my feet, squeaking like an out of tune mouse orchestra. I love that. I love it. I love the simile. I just loved it. I totally got it. I live in a really old house too, so
Mhm.
I loved it. And then there's this sentence about your daughter in the same chapter, which I'm probably going to laugh even as I say it. She is hot-headed, an unstoppable force of nature, a closer of bounce houses. That's my favorite. Oh my god. And her specialty is the tragic comedy. I felt like in those 2 sentences, I knew who your daughter was. It was just such a great example of showing her, and the closer of bounce houses, there has to be a story behind that. Is there?
I mean, there have been many bounce houses, and I mean, our life as a bounce house. I don't know how we're still standing. Um, yeah, my daughter is amazing. I like to say she's a lot like me, and how um, forceful her personality can sometimes be. I sometimes am very overwhelmed by it, and I'm still learning how to react to it in a way that is therapeutic to both of us. Um, but yeah, all those things are very accurate. And my son, who is not mentioned in the book as often as my daughter is, because he was actually much younger when the book was being written in its main form, is acquiring much of this, the same character qualities. But he's a completely different person too.
Yeah, you talk a lot about their relationship as siblings.
Yeah, there's a whole
Eh
chapter about siblings.
yeah, I really, I don't think my brother and I were ever that close, but I really appreciated the chapter and the way you described them. All right, so I'm gonna go back to or no, next to I really love this chapter, being a parent today, for today, and just being in the moment. So again, I want to quote you and talk about it a little more. The amount of information can be dizzying. Parents must take in all this information while navigating through a vast array of emotions. Amen. Living with a sick child or caring for a dying one turns that intention upside down. You have to focus on each day. I received this same advice when my sister was diagnosed from my best friend's mother, who was a scientist at the
Mhm.
time for NIH. And she said, you have to measure things in good hours and good days. And so I really, really liked this chapter. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to that theme. And also, as a reminder of people, if you're watching this in real time or later, please, any questions or comments you have, throw them in the comments.
Yeah, so that chapter is the first of the 16 meditations on parenthood. And I was really inspired by these parents who come in, all of a sudden they have a kid with cancer. The day before they didn't, and now they do. And I think a common thing of parenthood is just like laying in bed, staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, just wondering what the world's going to look like for your kids in like 5 or 10 years. Like it just seems like a very bleak place to me often, with climate change and pandemics and poverty, disease, just there's so much going on that is horrible. And the way for me to get through that feeling is to rationalize it basically. These parents, they they have that existential crisis that I have, at nighttime every single day. And it's immediate. It's not 10 years into
Yeah.
the future. It is now. It is what's going to happen to my child today. My child, in some cases, my child may die today. In some cases, my child, may find out something very impactful about their diagnosis today. And the only way to get through that is to be present in the moment. And I've, talked to so many parents who had different methods for just being so intimately involved in their child's care that they were able to just kind of be. Because, one thing that people don't really understand about in the hospital is that when you're a child or a parent and you're sick and dying, life doesn't stop. Even when you're dying, life continues. You continue to grow and learn and bump into things and make mistakes and have victories and laugh and giggle. I spend so much time listening to these hearts and these lungs in my stethoscope as I, take care of these kids. But I don't just hear body sounds. I hear snippets of conversation, and I hear laughter, and I hear giggles, and I hear cries. And it's really about being present in that moment, which is like a really easy thing to kind of talk about and suggest, but to actually do it and understand why it's important is a whole different thing.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with you 100%. I always say that cancer forces you to live in the present when you're
Hmm.
fighting cancer. You have to every single day. I want to talk about this next chapter, saying goodbye to your kids. And first, you talk about saying goodbye to your own kids. And you have this great line about them snoozing soundly in their shared bed, limbs tangled like human origami, which again, I loved. Great use of the line. But then you go back to your career and you say, every time a child dies, my sense of order leaps out the window, leaving me back in the room into my own devices to pick up the scattered pieces. And I, I just, as someone whose child has died, I really appreciated it. But I can't imagine going through that all the time. And you do. You go through that. You and your colleagues go through that all the time. So, can you tell us about a particular child's death that really had a huge impact on you and your colleagues?
I mean, every death affects us in some way. And sometimes we know a child really well. Like it might be a child who we have raised through cancer. Kids sometimes get diagnosed when they're really young and they go through relapses and um, remission and relapse and remission. And, they start as an 8-year-old kid with leukemia and they die as an 18-year-old with leukemia. So over that course of 10 years or however long that journey takes, gosh, we get to know these kids so well, so well. We know what they like. We know what they don't like. We know what they need. We know their family members. We know their uncles. We know their uncle's dog. I mean, we just like we're intimate, and I don't think that a death of a child that you know that well, or even who you don't know, ever leaves you unchanged. Um, and you know, the funny thing is, before I was a nurse of kids, I never thought about kids dying. I mean, who does? It's just like it's not in your view, but I'm just so used to it now. So unfortunately, I think part of the way that we've survived is just becoming inured to it. Um, and it's not in a callous way. It absolutely is not. You know, so many bad things happen in the world, and you know, many of them we don't see. We're unaware of them because they're happening in a different country or a different place or a different time. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So I'm actually so grateful to be there in that space. You know, to be at the bedside of a dying child for me is a real opportunity to just be an amazing presence for a family, to do anything they need to make that moment better. And I think it's a very special time. I don't want it to happen, but just because you don't want something to happen doesn't make it so. You know, many things are inevitable. We're all going to die. Um, in 80 years, both of us and most of these people listening will be dead, right? But, you know, who are we in that moment of death? And, you know, what do we have to offer? And I see it as a great opportunity to just to really, you know, be part of something that can be beautiful. And it's a weird way to look at it. I don't think most people see death like that, but you know, death is part of life.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. We're all dying. I don't know if you can answer this, but if you had to ballpark, what percentage of your patients die in the hospital? What percentage die at home? Because I feel like one of the best gifts I gave my sister was I fought her doctors really hard and was able to take her home where
Hmm.
she passed away very peacefully, in her bed surrounded by people who loved her. And so I'm just curious, do you have any sense of what that, ratio is?
I don't. And you know, and the interesting thing about my job that does relate a bit is that you know now when a child gets leukemia, you know, there's an 80% chance, depending on the type of leukemia, that they will have full remission. They'll just become healthy kids at some point. But I see the really sick kids, the kids who I get to know are the kids who don't have those chances. You know, these kids with intractable leukemias and brain tumors that not only are probably incurable, but also it's going to be a long journey. Um, a lot of those kids, um, they don't want to die at home because you know, that's just not where they wanna be. They don't have the pain control, they don't have the support. So, it's very common for those kids to die in the hospital. But some kids
They
and,
don't wanna die at home or their parents don't want them to die at home?
I think it's a choice they make together. You know, of course, sometimes there's no choice. Sometimes in order to prolong life, you need in order to prolong life and to be able to die well, meaning not in just, like, in excruciating pain, you need to be at the hospital. So their parents and sometimes that child makes that choice. You know, it is such a balancing act, you know, depending on the age of the child and their ability to talk about what they want and what they need. So that's, you know, that you bring that up, that's very true that sometimes parents make choices for kids that they would not make for themselves or they're not able to make for themselves. But you know what?
I
Yeah. Yeah,
no,
please.
I gotta say something 'cause I radically disagree with you
Uh-huh.
about being in the hospital and, if you get proper palliative care, right, um, then there is no reason that you can't die at home, not in any pain whatsoever, and
Uh-huh.
so I'm just gonna disagree with you,
Oh, well, it
be
depends on the
because
diagnosis, and it depends on that child. Every child is
I think it
different.
depends on the care you get because I've seen all kinds,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I've seen good deaths, I've seen bad deaths, and I don't know any adult, at least. Again, I think for kids under a certain age, it might be hard to form an opinion, but I don't think any adult wants to die in a hospital. But
Uh-huh.
there is a real misunderstanding and lack of communication and sometimes lack of resources around palliative
Absolutely.
care and
Yeah.
hospice, right? There's often just a huge disconnect, and lack of understanding. So, um, I can't imagine that if you do have access to those resources and you get them and you understand them, um, why you would be in more pain at home than you would be at the hospital. So,
So what you're talking about, healthcare is not equitable. Many families don't have the resources,
oh, I
and the
know
way
that.
our healthcare system works, there's many drugs that are not available at home. For instance, one drug that we are able to give our patients in the hospitals, it's ketamine. It's a drug that, um, it's not really well understood by people who don't give it. It's an amazing drug that helps kids be more comfortable. It potentiates opiates, so they're getting double the pain coverage that they would at home. A drug like that, you can't give in a home care setting. It's just not available. So, and I
Well, maybe
totally,
that's what needs to change, right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah, we're not talking about an ideal healthcare system. We're talking in a completely imperfect, flawed healthcare system. And that's the healthcare system that I exist in and that I live in. And once again, I don't make these choices. I accept the patients that come to me and do my best to take the care for them when they're in the hospital. But no patient is the same.
Oh, I
I
know. I agree.
completely echo what your experience with your daughter was and taking care of her at home and how that was the best thing for you and her. But for some patients, it's not. I've heard patients tell me that they want to be in the hospital. That's where they feel safe. That's where they feel cared for. They don't have the resources at home. They don't have the family support at home. There's so many factors that go into, where you feel most comfortable to die. And, every situation is different. So I can see like how that viscerally affects you to hear that because it was, these situations are very different from what you had to offer for your daughter.
Yeah, but I don't mean just her. I mean other deaths in my family as well,
Sure.
where
Yeah.
someone was in a hospital and it was horrible and excruciating and where,
Hmm.
someone was home. But, um, I wanna move on because I have, as you know, a best line and a best sort of whole paragraph in the book, and this was my favorite line in the book. The power of magical thinking and sheer hope in the face of such grim possibilities can be startling. It is possible to believe in it is possible to believe in the impossible, even when every fact before you runs counter to, and then for some reason I forgot to copy and paste the last few words of that sentence, but I really appreciated this because um I lived in a very healthy state of denial. Like deep, deep down to my core, I knew my sister wasn't going to make it because of all these other things that had happened. They were sort of outside her actual diagnosis. It was something I knew deep to my core. But from like the middle and up, and especially on the surface, I mean, I had to be in that place where I had the magical thinking. I had to be, I absolutely, otherwise, I personally, as a caregiver, could not have gotten through the day if I didn't have hope. Um, so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, about this power of magical thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a device that all humans use to make it through the day. How we convince ourselves that something isn't what it is. And
Yeah.
it is very effective. It helps us cope, but ultimately it has to end because reality will take over. You can only pretend away what is true for a short amount of time or sometimes a long amount of time. So I think is a very human device, and I have used it unconsciously myself all the time. I still use it, but ultimately, it's not going to be something that can sustain because reality will come through, but it doesn't make it any less human or any less effective or sympathetic.
That was well said. One of the things I like about anger that I feel like most people don't realize is that, you have all these different emotions, right? The five stages of grief that
Mhm.
occur for both the patient and the parents. And anger is actually, I think we're like told that you don't want to feel angry, but anger is a good emotion to have because you are living in reality if you're angry. You're not in denial. You're actually in it if you feel anger. And I feel like that's an emotion that we tell people to stifle at times. And you did a really, really good job of showing how different parents react in different situations, how sometimes the experience is clearly drawing them closer, and then at other times they're screaming at each other,
Mhm.
right in front of you and right in front of their own child. So I feel like you did a really, really good job of that. Um, I want to talk about this last paragraph. And before I do, just a reminder, we've gotten some thumbs up and people are watching, but please put any questions you have in the comments, even if you're watching this on a replay. We'll make sure that David gets them. And if you can also tag him, that would be even better. But put any comments you have. So this was my favorite paragraph. And I know I'm not completely done with the book, but I just can't imagine anything topping this paragraph. And I'm going to try to get through it without crying. Meeting Jason for the first time was like walking into a cinematic memory. He was a teenager, but his appearance reminded me of the extraterrestrial from the movie E.T. His body was a study in contrast. His torso was so chaotic from poor nutrition that his ribs pushed against his skin like steps leading up to a hugely distended belly. His arms and legs were long and lanky like those of an awkward adolescent, but atrophic and knobby at the joints, like those typically found on an old man. When he tried to stand up, this is the hardest part, his body swayed from side to side and his limbs wobbled like bamboo stalks in the wind. I had a hard time moving forward in that chapter. Um, I was really struck by how you described Jason. You did such a good job. And would you tell us a little bit more about Jason? And then also, before I hit record, we talked a little bit about your writing process and how you learned to show and not tell. So I'd like to cover that as well. But let's start with Jason first.
Yeah. So, you talked about, we talked about earlier about why I decided to write this book. And he's why. My son was not born yet, but he was about to be born. And I took this patient, Jason, and you read about how he appeared to me. But when he came to us, he was expecting a liver transplant. He was, a chronically ill kid, and he was hopefully going to have a new chance at life. But when the doctors did more, um, when they looked at him, they realized that he had a giant tumor on his liver, and there was no way he was going to have a transplant. And not only that, he was going to die within weeks. So the existential and physical pain that this kid was going through was not only overwhelming for him, but overwhelming for me as a caregiver. Um, and there was this process of me trying to understand him and get to know him, but it was so difficult because he was in so much pain. Like, it was impossible for me to even believe that he had ever existed in a world without extreme physical and existential pain. And I remember, about a couple weeks into his care, he hadn't taken a bath for a long time, and he hadn't even gone out of bed. And I, being a parent myself, I just got him out of bed, and because I think he didn't want. It's probably so hard to think that taking a bath is an important thing to do when you're a dying teenager. But he just didn't want to listen to me anymore. So he got out of bed. He let me bathe him,
He
and
didn't want you to nag him anymore.
he didn't want me to nag him. And I remember we were, he was standing up and leaning against me, and I and a couple of my coworkers bathed him. And it was just it was a really beautiful moment. It was we were all so present and taking care of this boy. And I remember after that bath, he laid down and he just put his hands behind his head, and he was just in this zen, calm place. And then a couple hours later, it was just me and Jason in his room, and his family had, gone off to, cope in their own ways. And I thought he was sleeping in that moment. And it was a dark room, and I was charting, and he said, "David." And he had never used my name before. I'd known him for weeks, and he never even, I don't think he ever even saw me as another person. He said, "David, do you have a cat?" And I said, "Jason, I do have a cat, except she gets ignored these days because we have a toddler too." And he
Mm.
said, "David, we have cats too. We have 3 of them. But one of them stopped eating, and so we had to put her down." And I said, "Jason, I'm so sorry. I was feeling so much grief for him, but also for his cat in that moment.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry that it's so hard when you lose somebody that you love." And he said, "David, it's okay. Because if you love cats, you have to get used to them dying."
Oh gosh.
And it was
I
so
remember
clear
that.
to me in that moment that he was talking about his cat, but he was also talking about himself.
Yeah.
That if you love life, you have to be okay with dying. because that's what life is. It's a process in living and then dying. And, there's no way of getting away from that. And those words just stayed with me. They just echoed in my head for weeks, and I started writing after that.
Oh gosh. I don't think it's ever okay for a child to die. Like, I
It's
just
not.
yeah, it's just not. So tell us a little bit more, we'll get into, like, nerdy writing thing, before we wrap up, about learning how to show in your writing and not telling.
It's a real delicate process because I think showing is really important. It's using imagery and dialogue to carry a story rather than trying to tell. But I think the real danger in that is that you can get really lost in description. And that's something that I fell victim to quite a bit in this writing. And, my editor really would always push back, like, show me something deeper. Like, I'm feeling this kid. I see what he looks like or what she looks like, but show me something deeper and show me how this affects you and how it changes you and why the reader should care about this. So showing that telling is so important, but if you have nothing behind that, if it doesn't bring you to a deeper understanding, that's just a bunch of words. you
Oh,
have to
yeah,
you have to
yeah.
let you have to let that description bring you somewhere. It can't
Yes.
be an empty space.
Yeah, oh, I totally agree. Yeah, it's not description for the sake of description. It's
Yeah.
actually, you know, it's just showing. I kinda liken it to in the movies, it drives me crazy when there's abundance of music, and it's really clear the music is telling you how to feel, right, in that moment, it's like, "This is what we want you to feel," instead of, less music, trusting that the story carries itself, trusting that the plot and the characters and the dialogue is all there, and then letting the audience, or for a book, the reader actually, infer their own feelings, let them come up with it. I mean, for me as a writer, that's one of the most entertaining things is when I read a review and someone has talked about a very specific part of my book and they loved it and this is why, and then someone will say the exact same thing, very specific part of the book, and they hated it and that was why. And that's
Yeah.
okay. It's
Oh, absolutely
okay.
okay.
So I think you did a great job of showing it and in a way that really, took us there with you. And I want to end on like a lighter note. We've got a couple minutes left, and then we're going to end on this and then tell people how to get in touch with you. But this was the only time I laughed out loud in your book. But
The
oh my
only time,
god,
huh?
huh?
The only time, huh?
It's really the only time.
Mhm.
Well, I laughed. Your descriptions of your kids are really funny, but this was like loud laugh. I have a very loud laugh anyway. But Code Brown. So I had no idea that that's what it was called, but I'm just going to read this little part. The scene I walked into in room 9 was a flushed and elderly Ms. Hong standing in the middle of what was easily a 3-foot wide puddle of diarrhea, massively explosive diarrhea all over the room. It was all over the floor, all over the bed, and all over, and it goes on and on and on. I don't know why. I mean, I'm not that person who uses poop emojis, but oh god, this was just so funny. It really, really was. And Ms. Hong was when you were in nursing school, is that
Yeah,
correct?
it's when I was taking care of adult patients still.
Yeah. Um, Talk to us about Code Brown.
I mean, so first I'll premise with, this is a heavy book. I get that. It was heavy to write, it's heavy to read. So I made a real effort to include really light, funny experiences that happen in
Yeah.
the home and hospital. And I call these experiences break from the heartbreak. And they're interspersed every 2 chapters. And I think they really help the reader experience levity and the idea that you can find real transcendence in these hard moments. There's joy there. In any case, yeah, Code Brown is very much a part of the hospital experience. There's Code Red, it's for fire, Code Silver for an active shooter, Code Pink for a baby that's been abducted, and there's Code Brown. It's not on any list, but it is truly a code. When you walk into a situation where there is so much feces around that you literally need to bring in other people to help. I had one of those recently, honestly, in the hospital, and they can be very hard moments because it's so hard for when that happens to you. It's not easy. And I think when people talk about the dignity of dying, they're talking about not stooling themselves. Like that's
Yeah.
I've heard many interviews where that's how many people feel about about dying. But when you and I see this a lot, when you totally give in to letting somebody care for you, a lot of that stuff just kind of drifts away. And you're able to be taken care of even in these really indelicate, gross situations with such grace. And I get to that place with so many of my patients, and it's so wonderful. And you just find levity in these hard moments that otherwise would be disgusting to the most, average person. But
Yes.
it's just part of our lives. Like, when you're a nurse, you deal with poop. It's
Yeah.
just how it goes. It's normal.
Well, I do like to think that COVID has brought on a much deeper appreciation for not only teachers but also healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, everybody on your care team. So I have one like not so funny, one funny thing to relate to this, and this is probably why I laughed out loud, not just by the description and the experience, but the not so funny I'll start with, and I can't even believe I'm sharing this because I don't think I've ever told anyone this. I don't think it's in my book at all, but could be. Um, is I had Graves' disease in my 20s, but before I got diagnosed, I ended up in a very emergency situation in the hospital where my lying down pulse was 150 beats per minute, and I got admitted immediately to LA County, and I had no insurance. And I wasn't even in a room. I was in the occupational unit. And one of the symptoms of Graves' disease is diarrhea.
Hmm.
Your body's working at such a fast pace. It's basically like your body's always moving, moving, moving. And that first night after like friends had left and whatever, and I was by myself, I stood up and totally like lost control of my bowels. I didn't even think I had any food left in me. I didn't, but and I was so embarrassed. I was embarrassed. I was humiliated. And this nurse came over and she was fantastic. It was like it was nothing for her, you know, and it certainly wasn't like this 3 foot wide perimeter. It was nothing like that. But but she just made it okay. You know,
Yeah,
she made it all right. And
that's what
she
we're
helped,
there for.
yeah, and she helped me get cleaned up, and I still remember that. And then on the sort of funny flip side, I remember when I had my English Mastiff, I had him for over 10 and a half years before he died. But when he was a puppy and he was still being potty trained, and he had pooped in the kitchen. You know, he was very young, still being potty trained. So I'm cleaning it up, and it's definitely, I would say, diarrhea. It's very runny. I put it into the bag, and I didn't check the bag for holes, the plastic bag, the kind you get from the grocery store. Didn't check it. So I go to pick up the bag, and I kind of like gave it just a little bit of oomph when I picked it up, and feces like all everywhere, all over the kitchen. I mean, I just looked around like, wait, did this just happen? Did I just do this? And so yeah, I always check the bags for holes if you have dogs.
Seems like
And
a good advice.
yeah, yeah. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is horrible. And I gotta clean all this up myself. But I really appreciate you coming on today, David. If people want to find your book, what's one, the best way to find your book, and two, the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, you can search for Nurse Papa. It's the book is sold primarily on Amazon, but you can also go to my website, nursepapathebook.com. You can also take a listen to my podcast, Nurse Papa, that tells many of the stories in my book, but also, um, stories of just about the experience of being a parent. I really enjoy interacting with my listeners. I also have a segment called Dear Nurse Papa, in which I answer parent questions on the show. And you can always contact me at david@nursepapathebook.com to find out more about my book, to send me a question that will be on my podcast, or just to chat
Before we say goodbye, is there any question that you get in particular that's just more prevalent than others
about the book.
about being a parent?
Oh, they are such ridiculous questions. They're not common questions. Um, I would say that there's no average.
No average question.
Yeah, no. The questions are actually so ridiculous that I really have to just think out of the box about um, about what the proper solution may be, and they're hilarious. I love these letters I get from parents. It's really an enjoyable part of the show.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so if you want to get in touch with David, nursepapathebook.com. Go there and get the book. And also, if you want to email him, David at nursepapa.com, nursepapathebook.com.
That's right.
Um, Thank you. Thank you so much, David. If you're watching the replay on this and you have a question for David, please put it in the comments. We'll make sure you guys get connected. And join me next week for another LinkedIn Live at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.